Hey there guys, we're taking a look at Red Dead Redemption 2 single player running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U, this time with 16 gigabytes of RAM. We've taken a look at it before running with 8 gigabytes of RAM, and what we ran into was just problems with 1% lows more than anything else. The averages certainly weren't good at 1080p with FSR 2.0 running at the performance mode, but it was the 1% lows that really dragged everything down. There was just inconsistent stuttering throughout the whole experience, and really the only way to get a playable frame rate was to drop the resolution all the way down to 720p and use FSR with performance mode on top of that. But you can see here running with the built-in benchmark towards the end scene, the level of performance that we're getting is far better in the sense that while an average of 25 isn't amazing, the 1% lows being at 20 means that this is a very consistent experience. If you're someone that's used to gaming on an APU like this is already going to be a very playable experience considering that we are at 1080p. Now this is with FSR 2.0 running in performance mode, so we're running at a much lower resolution than 1080p, but in general it looks fine enough that I think a lot of people would be perfectly fine playing like this. And this is also at the stock 15 watt TDP. Now with that said though, we are kind of at the edge of what's going to be playable. There's going to be segments in the game that are going to bring down the whole gaming experience, but I think that in general you'll more than likely adjust to this. It almost feels like playing the game on something like a PlayStation 3. So while it's not the most ideal levels of performance, it is at least doable, but we can't try to improve this if you're on a system that actually lets you raise the TDP up to 25 watts, and we'll take a look at that right now. And you can see here that what that actually ends up doing to the performance is boosting the overall experience just slightly, where our 1% lows are now in the mid 20s and our average is essentially around 30, and it almost always consistently stays around 30 here. Now there is no VSync or anything like that is limiting this. I thought that since it was so consistently at 30 that it might have been set to like half rate for VSync, but no, VSync was completely off. We were just getting pretty much a 30 FPS average on here. And overall, it was a decent enough experience. Again, if you're someone that's used to gaming on an APU, getting this level of performance on a AAA title with a base resolution of 1080p is actually really decent. Now again, FSR 2.0 is doing all of the heavy lifting here, where we're running this at a much lower resolution than 1080p, but it is being upscaled up to 1080p, and it looks, again, decent enough considering that if we just lowered the base resolution to what FSR performance mode runs it at, it's going to look significantly worse than this. Now, it's not the most beautiful implementation of FSR 2.0. It certainly looks rough in the edges of a lot of things, and when things are in motion, there is a slight trail of ghosting to them. But considering that we do get a playable experience out of this in comparison to anything else, I am more than happy to make that sacrifice, and I think that a lot of people are going to be very satisfied with this, and we're just getting a overall much better experience than if we were just at the 8 gigabytes of RAM. I think that if you're on one of these systems and you're limited to 8 gigabytes of RAM, you might have to either consider upgrading your RAM if you have the slots for it, or if you're on a system that doesn't have upgradable RAM, then really consider getting yourself a new system, because the longevity that you get from having 16 gigabytes of RAM or even all the way up to 32 is going to make the experience overall better. And jumping into some of the actual gameplay here, you'll see that at the 25 watt TDP, we really do get a very rock solid and consistent gaming experience here. When it comes to gaming at these lower frame rates, where you're not exactly hitting averages that are exactly at 30 or anything like that, what you want is your 1% lows and those frame times to be as close to each other as possible, where the 1% lows, you want them to be as close to the average as possible, and you want your frame times to be as consistent and flat as possible. Even if the latency is going to be high there, where we're getting, latency all the way up into the 40 millisecond range, that's fine, because again, we are at a lower frame rate, so the time in between each frame is inherently going to be longer, but you just want it to be consistent, because a lot of the time what you end up feeling as bad performance or just bad levels of an experience in a game isn't necessarily having a low frame rate. It is having an inconsistent frame rate, having those fluctuations from anywhere down up from 40 all the way down to 20, 15, anything like that. If you have that wild fluctuation and it's happening all the time to the point where your frame times just look like they're dancing around on the screen, that is what you're feeling. You're not necessarily feeling a lower frame rate, you're feeling an inconsistent frame rate. So since we're having an overall very consistent experience here, that is the most ideal scenario for a lower frame rate like this. You can get adjusted to playing like this. It's not the most ideal scenario, but it is far better than where we were at with just 8 gigabytes of RAM. And just for testing purposes, I also did drop the resolution down to 720p and use FSR 2.0 on top of that, which is what we had to do with 8 gigabytes of RAM to get anywhere near an actual playable experience. And when we do that here with 16 gigabytes of RAM, you can see our 1% lows are actually looking really nice, and our averages are also really nice. So we get a very decent level of performance, though again, we get all of the visual issues that came with just using this lower resolution like we did before. Especially at a distance, it was very difficult to see the enemies, and if you look at them, they kind of just turn more into blobs than anything else. There's not really that much detail on the enemies. They are kind of just blobby because there's a lot of ghosting and artifacting that's happening around their edges, and that's just an inherent problem with FSR, that if you're using the higher quality settings for it, you don't necessarily see it as much. But obviously, since we have to use FSR performance mode to even get this level of performance, then it's just one of the trade-offs that you have to make. If you are fine with getting more of a 30 FPS average at this low of a resolution, you can turn up FSR from performance up to balance. But I think that at that point, there was no reason to really drop down to 720p. You might as well have just played at 1080p with the performance preset. But anyways, I hope you found this look at Red Dead Redemption 2 single player running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U to be useful. It certainly was very interesting to me. I actually was not expecting a performance uplift that was this good, but it was a welcome surprise. If you found this video useful, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.